And I've been playing with Paul since I was 15. And he's very nice.
And he's very nice.
You must be pleased with what Paul's doing now, John.
I'm pleased that everybody's doing well, you know. Yeah. I'm more pleased that Ringo's doing well, you know, that he's got himself a good niche. Because I knew Paul would be all right. What the hell am I worried about him? You know, I know he's going to be all right.
Get ready to uncover the shocking truth about John Lennon's most bitter music rivals. In this video, we'll delve into the fascinating stories behind the Beatles' biggest music enemies, exploring the feuds, controversies, and rivalries that shaped his career. John Lennon, the man who asked us to give peace a chance and imagine no possessions. He built a legacy on love, a global icon of tranquility who dreamed of a world living as one. But behind that carefully crafted image, behind the round glasses and the gentle voice, was a razor-tongued critic who could tear another musician apart with a single, devastating sentence that he wasn't trying to be liked, he was trying to be real. And in his pursuit of what he saw as authenticity, he was brutally, unapologetically honest. When he disliked an artist, he didn't just whisper it to his friends. He made it loud, public, and unforgettable. His words could be cutting and cruel, leaving scars on the reputations of even his most celebrated peers. Today, we're pulling back the layers of the peace and love persona to reveal the fiercely competitive artist underneath. These are the top 5 musicians John Lennon just couldn't stand. And the man he targeted at number 1, was the person he could never quite escape. If you're ready for the untold stories of rock's biggest rivalries, the feuds and the fallouts that shaped music history, then make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss the brutal truths we're about to uncover. Coming in at number 5 isn't a single person, but an entire band that, to John Lennon, represented everything he grew to despise about where rock and roll was heading: blood, sweat and tears. Now, Lennon's problem with this band wasn't about a personal feud or a backstage fight. It was a philosophical rejection of their sound, which, in his eyes, was a betrayal of rock's raw, rebellious spirit. Blood, Sweat and Tears were a commercial powerhouse in the late 60s and early 70s, known for a brand of jazz-rock fusion that was technically brilliant and hugely popular. They had complex horn arrangements, polished vocals, and a sophisticated musicality that critics adored. And John Lennon apparently couldn't stand it. In his legendary 1971 interview with Rolling Stone, Lennon didn't mince words. When asked about the music scene, he unleashed on what he saw as rock's growing pretension. "I don't like the blood, sweat and tears shit," he stated bluntly. "I think all that is bullshit." For Lennon, this was a matter of principle. He saw rock and roll as the voice of the working class, primal and authentic. In his view, bands like Blood, Sweat and Tears were sterilizing it, smoothing out the rough edges and turning it into what he called noise trying too hard to be important. He elaborated, saying, "Rock and roll is going like jazz. And the bullshitters are going off into that excellentness which I never believed in." That word, excellentness, was delivered with a sneer. It represented technical skill over raw feeling, something Lennon, the self-proclaimed working-class hero, saw as music made by and for the establishment. It lacked the dirt under its fingernails that he believed was essential to the genre. There might have been another reason for his disdain. In 1970, Blood, Sweat and Tears' self-titled album won the Grammy for Album of the Year. One of the albums it beat? Abbey Road by the Beatles. While Lennon had already emotionally checked out of the band, seeing their final masterpiece lose to a group he considered bullshitters probably didn't help his opinion of them. Lennon's dismissal of Blood, Sweat and Tears was a declaration of his artistic values. He was drawing a line in the sand between the pretentious artists and the true believers. And his feelings for our next artist were far more personal, escalating from artistic disagreement to a full-blown public feud. At number 4, we have a rivalry that was less about philosophy and more of a direct, personal, and very public war of words. This was a classic 1970s press feud between two brilliant and outspoken artists, John Lennon and Todd Runren, Todd Runren was a rising star in the early 70s, a musical prodigy known for his ambitious work in hits like I Saw the Light and Hello It's Me. And he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it meant taking a shot at a Beatle. The feud kicked off in 1973, when Rundgren gave an interview to the British music magazine Melody Maker. He didn't just criticize John Lennon, he took a flamethrower to his entire persona. At the time, Lennon was in his lost weekend period, separated from Yoko Ono and living a life of drunken excess in Los Angeles while also being a vocal anti-war activist. Rundgren saw this as pure hypocrisy. John Lennon ain't no revolutionary, Rundgren declared. He's a fringy idiot, man. Shouting about revolution and acting like an ass. It just makes people feel uncomfortable. Rundgren accused Lennon of using activism for self-promotion before landing a deeply personal blow about a notorious incident at a nightclub, hitting a waitress in the Troubadour. What kind of revolution is that? To top it off, he compared Lennon to Richard Nixon, saying both were out for himself underneath it all. Lennon, who prided himself on his authenticity, was being called a phony and a hypocrite in a major music paper. He fired back with a scathing open letter, also in Melody Maker, addressed to Todd Runren. On being a revolutionary, he wrote, I have never claimed to be a revolutionary. But I am allowed to sing about anything I want. Right? On the Troubadour incident, he admitted fault but brushed it off. I never hit a waitress in the Troubadour, I did act like an ass, I was too drunk. So shoot me. But his most cutting remarks were aimed at Rundgren's music, offering backhanded praise for the song, I Saw the Light, which he noted was not unlike There's a Place, Beatles, melody-wise. It was a subtle way of saying, you're just copy. Feud was short but intense. It showed a combative Lennon who would ferociously defend his corner. Yet, if his feud with Rundgren was about his public image, his feelings toward our next artist were rooted in something deeper, the painful experience of watching a god become a mere mortal. At number 3 is a figure who wasn't just another musician to John Lennon. This was his god. The man who started it all. Elvis Presley. Lennon's relationship with him followed a tragic arc from pure hero worship to bitter disappointment. When a teenage John Lennon first heard Heartbreak Hotel, it changed his life. Elvis was danger, sexuality, and liberation rolled into one, the blueprint for everything Lennon wanted to be. He grew his sideburns like Elvis, got in trouble at school like Elvis, and started a band to be like Elvis. For years, meeting Elvis was the dream. In August 1965, it finally happened when the Beatles were driven to Elvis's Bel Air mansion. But the reality was a crushing letdown. The atmosphere was awkward and stilted. The Beatles were starstruck, and Elvis seemed distant. But the real source of Lennon's disillusionment was a fundamental clash of values. The rebellious rocker of the 50s was gone, replaced by a clean-cut movie star. Worse, Elvis had become part of the very establishment rock and roll was supposed to defy. This was most obvious when it came to politics. Lennon was becoming a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. Elvis was a staunch supporter of the government. According to accounts, Lennon annoyed Presley by making a crack about his pro-war memorabilia. The political gulf between them was just too wide. Lennon left feeling he hadn't met the real Elvis. The force of nature he idolized was gone, replaced by a sanitized corporate version. He would later cruelly remark after Elvis's death, he died when he went in the army. That's when they killed him. The rest of it was just a living death. The feeling was reportedly mutual. Elvis grew to dislike what the Beatles represented, seeing their counterculture influence as anti-American. It's been widely reported that Presley even lobbied President Nixon and the FBI to have Lennon deported, branding him a danger to the nation's youth. To John Lennon, the story of Elvis was a cautionary tale of a hero who had sold his soul for fame, a fate he was determined to avoid. At the number 2 spot is a clash that reveals one of the more complicated sides of John Lennon's personality. This wasn't a press feud, but a brief, cutting encounter with one of the most revered singer-songwriters of her generation, Joanie Mitchell. Lennon's issue wasn't with Mitchell's talent, but with what he perceived as her lack of authenticity. In his worldview, real art had to come from struggle. He was suspicious of anything that felt too intellectual or sophisticated. The infamous incident happened around 1974, during Lennon's Lost Weekend. Both artists were working in the same LA recording complex. Mitchell was crafting her masterpiece, Court and Spark, while Lennon was across the hall, often drunk and working on a rock and roll oldies album. Mitchell played him some of her new tracks. Lennon's response was not just dismissive, it was a deeply patronizing insult. He said, "Oh, it's all a product of overeducation," she recalled years later. He then twisted the knife. "You want a hit, don't you? Put some fiddles on it." This exchange was loaded with Lennon's artistic prejudices. To him, overeducation was an attack on art he saw as phony. Real music came from the gut, not the head. Mitchell later suggested it came from a place of class anxiety on Lennon's part. That's a class difficulty he had. He's a working-class lad, she explained. This wasn't an isolated opinion. In a 1971 Rolling Stone interview, Lennon expressed a dislike for what he called fruity folk singers, specifically naming Judy Collins and Joan Baez. He saw their music as too clean and disconnected from the real-world struggles he identified with. While he didn't name Mitchell then, his later comments to her face reveal a similar bias. Joanie Mitchell was reportedly deeply hurt, and it soured her opinion of Lennon for good. The put-down shows a core contradiction in Lennon, an artist who pushed his own music into experimental territory, yet could be incredibly dismissive of others who strayed from his narrow definition of authentic. But if his words to Joanie Mitchell were a swift jab, his battle with our number one artist was a long, brutal war, a conflict born not of simple dislike, but of a deep, fractured love, and here we are. Number 1. The musician John Lennon hated the most. But to call it just hate is to oversimplify the most complex, brilliant, and heartbreaking creative partnership of the 20th century. The number 1 spot could only ever belong to Paul McCartney. This wasn't a simple rivalry. It was a Greek tragedy played out on a world stage. It was the story of two brothers who made magic together and then turned on one another with a viciousness that could only come from profound love and even deeper hurt. The anger Lennon directed at McCartney after the Beatles split was the raw agony of a messy divorce, and he used his music as his weapon. When Paul McCartney effectively announced the breakup with his first solo album in 1970, it unleashed a torrent of resentment from Lennon, who felt betrayed that Paul had seized the narrative. The battleground quickly became their music. The first shot was fired by Paul on his 1971 album, Ram. The song, Too Many People, had jabs Lennon immediately recognized, like Too Many People Preaching Practices, a critique of his and Yoko's activism. Lennon was enraged. He decided to retaliate with a song so brutal it stands as one of the most famous diss tracks in history, How Do You Sleep? Released on his Imagine album in 1971, the song was a line-by-line takedown of Paul McCartney. To make the betrayal even deeper, the slide guitar was played by George Harrison. The lyrics were devastating. He mocked Paul's image, so Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise / you better see right through that mother's eyes. Then he attacked his musical legacy with the most vicious blow of all, the only thing you done was yesterday / and since you're gone you're just another day. In one couplet, he dismisses Paul's most famous song and his recent solo single. He even took a jab at Paul's marriage to Linda. The song sent shockwaves through the music world. The feud spilled into the press, with the two exchanging venomous open letters. And yet, even in the depths of this bitterness, the complexity of their bond was clear. Lennon later admitted the song was really about his own pain. I was using my resentment towards Paul to create a song, he confessed. It was his anger at losing his band, his friend, his other half. Their relationship would eventually thaw, though they never worked together again. But in the years after the Beatles' collapse, no one bore the brunt of John Lennon's anger, wit, and insecurity more than Paul McCartney. He wasn't just an artist Lennon disliked, he was the mirror image he raged against, the brother he couldn't live with, and the partner he could never truly replace, from the bullshit polish of blood, sweat and tears to the public feud with Todd Runren. From the disappointment of a fallen idol like Elvis to the condescending dismissal of a genius like Joanie Mitchell. And finally, to the epic, heartbreaking war with his creative soulmate, Paul McCartney. John Lennon's list of musical adversaries reveals his fiercely complex character. He was a man who preached peace but often waged war with his words. He demanded authenticity but was sometimes blinded by his own dogma and insecurities. His criticisms weren't just random anger. They were a reflection of his own towering standards and a fear of phoniness and hypocrisy. His feuds were messy, public, and often cruel, but they were undeniably real. In the end, Lennon's rivalries are as much a part of his story as his pleas for peace, reminding us that the most brilliant artists are rarely simple. They are complicated, contradictory, and profoundly human. John Lennon was all of those things, and it's that very complexity that makes his voice, in both song and criticism, continue to echo so powerfully today.